Racism is prejudice taken to its extreme. And we also have institutional racism. You can read the definition on your own. And if you look at the southern states, maybe the whites, they were more advanced. They came from other country. It's not my intention to offend anybody here. And after emancipation, blacks had to fight for their rights to vote from the whites because the whites were the first ones to establish a political and economic system. So they had a foothold before the blacks. And this is a manifestation of institutional racism. Are we clear? Question? And let me go off a tangent for a while. The same thing for the women's suffrage movement. Maybe men initially set up a political and economic system, a voting system, an election system, or whatnot. So because of that, same thing like the blacks, women had to advocate or fight for their rights to vote from the men. It seems that men had to grant women their rights to vote because they were the first ones to establish all these things. It's not anybody's fault. Are we clear? It seems to me institutional racism depends on who were the first ones to establish all these institutions and entities and whatnot. And because of that, the quote-unquote latecomers had to advocate, demand, or even fight for their equal rights. And in some countries, like Malaysia, I'm from Malaysia. So when we were governed by the Brits to prevent our own people from fighting for independence, the Brits had a divide and separate ruling policy. The different racial groups were allowed to continue with their own language in their own medium of schooling. So if they do things this way, it's hard for different racial groups to come together to communicate, to fight for independence. And some historians or social scientists think that because of this way of ruling, it delayed our independence. We could have fought for independence a few decades earlier if there was a common language. And with a common language comes a common culture. So, after independence, things were not very equal because different racial groups, they do their own thing. They have their own economic pursuits. Some are more profitable than others, for sure. So, to rectify things, our newly independent government instituted an affirmative action policy. They try to equalize things in terms of income, wealth, and education among racial groups. So they gave preferential treatments to some racial groups who were being shortchanged by the Brits. This is another form of institutional racism, maybe in a positive sense. Are we clear? And you have affirmative actions in your country too. It can be regarded as institutional racism in a more positive sense. Are we clear? And colorism is no-brainer. The root word will tell us prejudice based on skin color. And discrimination are actions against another based on all these criteria: age, religion, sex, and whatnot. And segregation is one manifestation of discrimination. And there's a distinction between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is in our own thought, is our mindset, our opinion. We don't always act out our opinion, but discrimination refers more to our actions. Make sure you know the distinction between the two. It looks like a very good matching question. You will have it. We don't always act out our prejudice, okay? So, more definitions. Racial steering. Racial steering is directed away from a neighborhood based on race. People are being directed away from a given neighborhood because of their race. That's what we mean by racial steering. And another concept important to know is redlining. Some racial ethnic groups, maybe because of racial steering, they had to look for houses in a different neighborhood, a not so good neighborhood, a not so safe neighborhood, a high crime neighborhood, or maybe certain racial group or ethnic group. They were being discriminated from an early age onwards. So they were being shortchanged in terms of income, education, occupation. So because of that, they don't qualify for good mortgage rates. They only qualify for what we call subprime mortgage, or they are refused mortgage because they don't have a checking account, they don't have a stable income, they don't have a full-time job, and so on. So this is what we mean by redlining. Are we clear? And in where I used to teach, Cleveland, Mississippi, there were one streets. We call that the Lee Street, L-E-E. The west side of the Lee Streets is where the whites live. Their houses looks very different. And it looks safer, cleaner, and whatnot. And the east side of the Lee Street is where the African Americans live. The houses look different, a bit more worn down, dilapidated, older homes and whatnot, with lots of holes on even the paved roads. Or some areas do not even have paved roads. So this is one manifestation of racial steering. Are we clear? Okay, so the three main theories or grand theories in sociology can be used to understand racial issues or race, the concept of race in our country, in any country. For the functionalism theory, everything plays a function, right? So all these concepts plays a function. Racism, it plays a function. Ethnic inequalities plays a function in society. And this function can be good functions or bad functions. Bad functions, we call them dysfunction. So all these are dysfunctions in society. They don't do society any good. When we perceive certain race as superior or inferior than others, it's going to lead to all kinds of dissatisfaction to the point of rallies or protests. It challenges the order and stability in any society. If certain quote-unquote inferiority, and I don't know how people define that, is justified, like the Jim Crow law in the South, is going to affect race relations in a negative way. It's a dysfunction to society. And because of racism, ethnic inequality, people overlook the talents of certain subordinated groups. people only focus on the skills and talents of dominant groups. So, racism play a positive function in society. And maybe some people from certain groups, they realize they are of a subjugated group. They work extra hard. Because of that, they succeed and excel despite government assistance. Even in the absence of government assistance, these groups excel. So racism, even though it's not a good thing, they play a positive function in society. They have two functions, negative and positive. The same thing for ethnic inequalities. It may propel some ethnic and racial groups to work extra hard to get what they want. And because of that, they can be more successful or they can be more resilient than other racial ethnic groups. And we can also view racism from a conflict theory perspective. The conflict theory, when they focus on issues pertaining to ethnic inequality and racism, they focus on the struggle among different racial groups. It can be whites and minorities. It can be within the Asian groups. And the Jim Crow law is one way how people view racism, ethnic inequality, segregation from a conflict theory perspective. I don't know if you've seen this movie. I think it's called Blue Babies. It's an old movie based on a true story. I don't know if you've seen that. And this Vivian Thomas, I think he is an African American guy. He lived during the time of Great Depression. And because of that, he did not get a chance to go to college or university. Oh, he passed away in 85. So, but he was interested in medical related careers, in dissecting animals and doing experiments in the lab. He read a lot of medical books as portrayed in the movie. And he self-taught himself a lot of lab techniques, a lot of experimental techniques, a lot of anatomy, and so on and so forth by reading by himself. Because he did not have a college degree, so he was bypassed for promotion or the operation on Blue Babies initially, even though he did a lot of work. This African American guy in the lab helping doctors with credentials. All the doctors, as portrayed in the movie, they got credit. Their pictures were being taken, they were being interviewed, and so on and so forth. He was bypassed until many decades later. Apparently, one of the doctors he worked for took him to Hopkins when he transferred to Hopkins. So people in Hopkins, even medical students, despite him not having a degree, they respected him. They asked him how to operate. They asked him about certain surgical procedures and so on and so forth. So one day, they realized we should give this guy an honorary doctorate. He was better than any one of us, despite not going to college and medical school. That's what they did. They gave him an honorary doctorate. So, his life story can also be a portrayal of the conflict theory. Maybe coming from a certain racial group. And given his family upbringing, he wasn't very wealthy according to the movie. His social status. Maybe all these things impeded him from going to college and to med school. So he was bypassed for promotions after promotions after promotions, even though his hand-eye coordination was top-notch. So we can understand his story from the conflict theory. And another theory is the intersection theory. So I'm sure you realize sometimes different dimensions of inequality interacts and intersects with one another to affect a person's outcomes in terms of health, in terms of income, in terms of education. This is portrayed in Vivian's biography. Let's say a woman from a racial background, and so happens she's a woman from a racial background, from a certain family upbringing. We have three dimensions of inequality here. And because of that, she had to earn a meager wage. She had to settle for low income jobs. And because of that, she had to live in certain neighborhoods with poor sewage system, with poor water quality. The neighborhood is also quite polluted. The neighborhood also lacks transportation. So she cannot take a bus if she doesn't have a car to go to a health facility to get her physicals. So as you can see, different dimensions of inequality interacts and intersect to affect a person's education, income, health, and other outcomes. Are we clear? This is what we mean by intersection theory. Clear? So, I think I'm at the stopping point. Okay, one more thing. So, women, for some cultural racial groups, they are already at a subordinated position. And if they happen to be belonging to a racial group, they face a double jeopardy. This is also a manifestation of the intersection theory. Okay, see you Friday.